Cassian Vayner sat in the back of his black car with his 8-year-old son beside him, and for the 1000th time in 2 years he wondered if there was anything left in the world that could bring the boy's voice back. Money had failed him. Influence had failed him. Power had failed him. Cassian was a man who could make cities rise from dust and could bend entire markets to his will. But as he glanced at Alaric's pale and silent face, he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He had spent fortunes on therapists, speech specialists, and doctors flown in from every continent. Yet the boy had not spoken a word since the night his mother died. The silence was no longer just a medical mystery. It was a prison that father and son shared together, and no amount of wealth could buy the key. In that car, on a clear Saturday morning, Cassian made a choice that was beneath the life he had built but perhaps closer to what his son needed. He told the driver to take them not to another clinic or a private retreat, but to a modest playground hidden in an ordinary neighborhood where no reporters would follow. It was desperation that made him go there, and desperation was not something Cassian Vayner allowed himself to show. The playground was almost insulting in its simplicity. Rusted swings, chipped slides, and a scattering of children in second-hand shoes filled the space. Cassian felt out of place in his tailored suit jacket, though he had left the tie at home in an attempt to look less like the billionaire on the magazine covers. Alaric walked slowly beside him, eyes down, clutching a small notebook where he sometimes drew but never wrote words. The boy looked too fragile for the world, and Cassian hated himself for not being able to shield him better. Other fathers around the park seemed relaxed and unburdened, pushing their children on swings, sharing jokes, living lives without the shadows that stalked his family. For Cassian, every smile was a reminder of what had been stolen from him and from his son. Yet here he was, hoping for a miracle in a place where miracles did not seem to belong. Alaric sat on one of the swings, his hands gripping the chains, his body swaying gently back and forth without making a sound. Cassian stood nearby, his phone buzzing in his pocket with calls from investors and executives, but he ignored them. Today was not about business empires or contracts. Today was about a boy who had locked himself away and a father who no longer knew how to reach him. Cassian was not used to helplessness. His entire identity was built on control. But as he looked at Alaric, he realized he was nothing more than a man begging for his child to look at him, to say his name, to prove that he had not lost everything the night his wife died. It was then that Cassian noticed a woman entering the playground with a young girl. The woman's clothes were simple, the kind bought on tight budgets, but she carried herself with quiet strength. Her daughter ran ahead with bright energy, her laughter cutting across the still air like a spark. The little girl was about Alaric's age, and she bounded toward the swings with the confidence of a child who believed the world would always welcome her. Cassian expected Alaric to shrink back as he always did when other children came close, but instead the boy lifted his eyes for the first time that day. Something in the girl's presence caught him, a curiosity he had not shown in months. The girl smiled at Alaric and without hesitation took the swing beside him. She began to talk in that open way children have, filling the silence with stories of how swings were secret flying machines and how if you pumped your legs hard enough you could reach the clouds. Alaric listened, his lips slightly parted, as though the sound of another child's voice was breaking through walls that no adult could touch. Cassian froze as he watched. He had seen his son stare blankly at therapists who used complicated exercises and expensive tools. He had seen him turn away from relatives who tried coaxing him with bribes and promises. But now, with this unknown girl babbling about clouds, Alaric seemed present in a way he had not been in 2 long years. Cassian's chest tightened when he saw the woman, clearly the girl's mother, approach. She introduced herself with a gentle politeness that contrasted with Cassian's rigid formality. Her name was Serenia Dar, and she looked at Alaric not with pity or with clinical judgment but with the natural warmth of someone who understood children. She did not press him, did not ask him to speak, did not remind him of his silence. She simply let her daughter continue her chatter. Cassian could not explain why, but he felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. Hope that this ordinary woman and her lively daughter might stir something in Alaric. fear that if they succeeded it would mean all his efforts had been meaningless. The moment came quietly, but it struck Cassian harder than any deal gone wrong or enemy in the boardroom. As the little girl leaned closer to Alaric and whispered a silly secret code, a faint sound slipped from his son's lips. It was not a full word, barely even a syllable, but it was sound. It was life. Cassian froze, his breath caught in his throat, his entire body rigid as though afraid to move and shatter the fragile miracle. Serenia heard it too, and her eyes widened, but she gave no sign that would pressure the boy. She simply smiled and let the children continue as if nothing unusual had happened. Cassian felt the world tilt beneath him. 2 years of silence had just cracked open, and it had not been his doing. Standing there in the sunlight, Cassian Vayner, the man who owned towers and fleets and commanded nations of employees, felt powerless in a way he had never known. He had just witnessed his son break silence for the first time since tragedy struck. And it was because of a stranger's child, not because of him. Gratitude and dread warred inside him. He did not know if this was the beginning of hope or another cruel trick of fate. But one thing was certain. His world had shifted. And he understood that nothing in his carefully controlled life would ever be the same again. Serenia Dar had never imagined that her ordinary Saturday would bring her into the orbit of a man whose name appeared in financial magazines and whispered conversations about power. She had lived most of her life far from that world. For her, life was about paying rent on time, stretching a modest paycheck to cover groceries, and making sure her daughter Alira grew up with more joy than struggle. She had walked into the playground that morning with nothing more in her mind than giving her daughter a chance to burn energy before the week began again. Yet the moment her daughter's eyes met the quiet boy on the swing, Serenia felt something shift in the air, as if the universe had quietly pulled 2 worlds together. She noticed the tall man standing nearby, his posture rigid, his eyes focused too intently on his son. She recognized immediately that he was not like the other fathers at the park. He carried the aura of someone who was used to command, someone who held authority even in silence. What struck her most was not his presence but the hollow in his eyes, the weight of unspoken grief he carried like a shadow stitched to his frame. Alira had no sense of these things. She saw only another child who looked lonely and in need of company. Without hesitation she invited the boy into her world, speaking quickly about secret codes and cloud flying, inventing games as only children could. Serenia expected the boy to ignore her daughter, as many shy children did, but instead she saw the faintest spark of curiosity in his gaze. It was small, fleeting, yet unmistakable. Serenia felt her breath catch when she heard the whisper that escaped his lips. It was almost too soft to notice, but as a mother she knew the difference between silence and sound. The father noticed it too. His entire body went rigid, as though the earth had stopped turning. Serenia's instincts told her to remain calm, to let the moment unfold without drawing attention to it. Children were delicate in their grief, and she knew better than to push. She let Alira keep speaking, her little voice bright and confident, filling the silence that the boy seemed ready to step out of for the first time. After a few minutes, Serenia stepped closer and offered a polite greeting. The man introduced himself in a voice that was smooth but carried strain beneath the surface. He said his name was Cassian Vayner, and in that instant Serenia placed it. She had heard of him before, in passing, the way anyone who read the news would have. Real estate tycoon, billionaire, a man who shaped skylines and bought companies as easily as others bought shoes. Yet none of that mattered in the quiet corner of the playground. What mattered was the boy, Alaric, and the way his father looked at him with desperate hope. Cassian thanked her daughter in a strained whisper, but his gratitude was tinged with disbelief. Serenia could sense that this man was torn between joy and confusion. She wondered what kind of life the boy had lived that even the smallest sound could move his father to near tears. As the children continued to play, Serenia noticed the way Alaric followed Alira's lead, timid but willing. It was as if her daughter's energy created a current strong enough to pull him along. She also noticed how Cassian's gaze never left his son, as though afraid that if he looked away, the fragile progress might dissolve. Serenia spoke quietly to Cassian, telling him that sometimes children needed other children more than adults to find their voices again. She did not say more than that. She kept her own story hidden, the years of study in psychology that had ended in disaster, the scandal that had stripped her of a career she once dreamed of. She had no intention of letting a man like Cassian Vayner know that part of her life. She had built walls to protect herself, just as surely as his son had built walls to protect his silence. Cassian asked cautiously if they could meet again, perhaps at the same playground, so the children could spend more time together. His words were polite but carried urgency. Serenia hesitated. She had learned long ago not to entangle her life with people who lived in worlds so different from hers. Yet when she looked at Alaric, his fragile posture, his eyes following her daughter with something close to longing, she knew she could not refuse. She agreed, though she made clear that this was for the children, nothing more. Cassian nodded, but she saw relief wash over his face. He seemed almost humbled, as if asking for this simple favor had cost him more than money ever could. In the days that followed, Serenia found herself replaying the moment at the playground. She thought about the way Alaric had whispered, how the sound had cracked open something heavy in the air. She wondered what story lay behind his silence, though she did not press for answers. Children carried burdens in ways adults often overlooked, and she respected that his voice would return only when he felt safe enough. At the same time, she found herself thinking of Cassian more than she expected. His presence was intimidating, but there had been vulnerability in his eyes. She recognized that kind of pain. It was the same look she saw in the mirror when she thought of the life she had lost years ago. When the weekend came again, Serenia brought Alira back to the playground. Cassian was already there with Alaric, waiting, his expression taut with anticipation. The children reconnected instantly, picking up their game as if no time had passed. This time, Alaric responded faster, moving when Alira beckoned, his lips twitching as though words hovered at the edge of release. Cassian's hands tightened around the swing chain, his whole body straining with the desire to see his son speak. Serenia placed a hand lightly on his arm, surprising even herself, and whispered that he should let the boy move at his own pace. Cassian looked at her with eyes that carried both gratitude and frustration. For a man used to controlling every outcome, waiting was torture. Over the next hour, Serenia saw something remarkable. Alaric laughed, not aloud but through expression, his eyes lighting, his body less guarded. It was not speech, but it was life returning. She watched Cassian, saw how every flicker of expression on his son's face cut through the armor he wore. She realized then that beneath his power and wealth, Cassian Vayner was simply a father drowning in helplessness. He had built empires, but here he was, standing on worn grass and cracked concrete, praying for his son to speak. Serenia understood that she was walking into something fragile, something dangerous even. The more time they spent together, the more she risked entangling her quiet life with his vast and complicated world. As they prepared to leave, Alira waved cheerfully at Alaric and shouted that she would see him next week. For the briefest moment, Alaric's lips moved as if to answer. No sound came, but Cassian saw it and his eyes glistened. Serenia caught the look and knew he was on the edge of breaking. She did not speak of it. She simply guided her daughter away, leaving Cassian with the heavy silence of hope. Cassian Vayner was a man who rarely allowed anyone to see weakness in him, but after the second meeting at the playground he felt as if his life had been cracked open. For the first time in years there was movement in his son's silence, and it had not come from the experts he had paid or the programs he had funded. It had come from the laughter of a little girl and the patience of her mother. Cassian told himself that it did not matter how it happened, only that it had, yet he could not escape the sting of jealousy that burned in his chest. He had given his son every resource in the world, yet it was a woman who lived in a modest apartment and worked 2 jobs who had managed to touch the boy's heart. That thought kept him awake at night, and it made him more restless than he had been during any business deal or negotiation. He decided that he could not let this slip away. If his son responded to Serenia and her daughter, then he would make sure they stayed close, no matter what it cost. Serenia noticed the change in him almost immediately. When they met again at the playground, Cassian came not just as a father but as a man with expectations. He wanted to know why Alaric had responded, what exactly Serenia had done, how it could be repeated and strengthened. He asked questions in the sharp tone of someone used to getting answers, but Serenia only smiled softly and told him that children healed in their own time. She explained that it was not about methods or secrets but about safety and patience. Cassian did not like that answer. Patience was not a word he valued. In his world, waiting meant weakness. He pressed harder, suggesting structured playtimes, regular schedules, even offering to pay Serenia for her time. She refused with quiet firmness, reminding him that this was about children, not transactions. Cassian felt anger flare inside him at being denied, though he knew she was right. He had always solved problems with money and control, but this was a problem that neither obeyed him nor respected his power. What Cassian did not know was that Serenia carried secrets of her own. She had once studied child psychology at a respected university and had been on the path to a promising career. But that future had been destroyed by a scandal that she had never spoken about to anyone outside her closest circle. A professor had taken advantage of her trust, twisting her research and reputation until she was left with nothing but shame. She had walked away from her dreams and rebuilt her life quietly, determined to give her daughter stability even if she never again touched the field she once loved. Watching Alaric brought all of that rushing back. She could see the signs of trauma in his silence, the fragile hope in his eyes. She knew what he needed, but she could not bring herself to tell Cassian the truth about her past. She feared he would see her as untrustworthy, that he would dig into her history and use it against her. And so she stayed silent about her knowledge, guiding the boy gently while letting Cassian believe she was nothing more than an ordinary mother with a kind heart. The tension between them grew with each meeting. Alaric improved slowly, responding with small sounds, moving closer to Alira, even showing hints of a smile. Cassian grew impatient, desperate to push harder, to speed the progress. Serenia pushed back, warning him that forcing his son would only drive him further into silence. Their arguments were quiet but sharp, words exchanged in low voices while the children played. Cassian accused her of holding back, of not doing enough, of being careless with the chance she had been given. Serenia accused him of being blind to his own son's needs, of trying to buy healing like he bought companies. The truth was that both of them were afraid. Cassian feared losing the progress that had begun. Serenia feared being drawn too deep into a world she had left behind. Yet beneath the anger there was something else forming, something neither of them wanted to admit. They were beginning to care not only about the children but about each other. One afternoon the argument reached its breaking point. Cassian arrived at the playground tense from a business call and already on edge. Alaric had been quieter that day, retreating back into himself, and Cassian blamed himself for not being able to hold on to the progress. When Serenia suggested that Alaric simply needed space, Cassian snapped. He accused her of treating his son like an experiment, of playing with his emotions. His voice was low but sharp enough to cut, and Serenia's eyes filled with anger. She told him he was suffocating his son, that Alaric did not need a billionaire, he needed a father who could wait. For a moment Cassian thought she would walk away and never return, and the thought terrified him more than losing $1 million deal. He reached for her arm, not roughly but desperately, and begged her not to leave. Serenia pulled back, her voice trembling as she told him that if he wanted her and her daughter to stay, he had to learn that healing was not about control. It was about trust. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the children's laughter in the distance. Cassian felt something in him shift, a realization that all his life he had commanded and demanded but never truly listened. He looked at Serenia and for the first time allowed himself to admit that he needed her. Not just because of Alaric, but because she saw through him in a way no one else did. Serenia, shaken by the intensity of the moment, turned away before he could say more. She gathered a lira and left the playground, leaving Cassian standing alone with his son, staring after her with a mixture of frustration, gratitude, and longing. He knew then that the battle was no longer about silence. It was about his own ability to change. What he did not know was that both his and Serenya's pasts were about to collide in ways that neither could have imagined, and the fragile bond between them would soon be tested far beyond the boundaries of the playground. The argument between Cassian and Serenya left a shadow that hung over the days that followed. Cassian replayed the moment again and again, angry at himself for losing control, angry at her for challenging him, but more than anything fearful that she would never return. Without Serenya and her daughter, Alaric would likely sink back into the silent shell he had lived in for years. Cassian was not used to needing anyone, but now he felt completely powerless without her presence. He forced himself to push aside his pride and waited at the playground the next week, hoping she would appear. When Serenya finally arrived with a lira, relief surged through him, though he hid it behind the cool mask he wore in every boardroom. She gave him only a small nod, nothing more, but it was enough. They stayed distant from each other, their words short and careful, but the children rushed into play as if nothing had happened. For a while Cassian allowed himself to believe that perhaps the worst was over. The belief shattered when he realized Alaric had slipped away. At first he thought the boy was behind the slide or hiding in the small cluster of trees. He called his son's name, his voice sharp, but there was no response. Panic rose in Cassian's chest. He had never felt so powerless. He searched the playground, his steps quickening, his voice growing louder. Serenya noticed the fear in his eyes and quickly joined the search, calling to Alira to stay close. Minutes passed like hours. The other parents watched with uneasy curiosity but offered little help. Cassian's heart pounded as he scanned every corner, every path, every shadow. He had failed once to protect his family, and the memory of losing his wife came crashing back with brutal force. He could not lose his son too. He could not live through that nightmare again. It was Serenya who spotted the small figure in the distance, standing dangerously close to a street that curved sharply around the park. Cassian followed her gaze and froze when he saw Alaric. The boy was standing rigid, staring at the asphalt as if transfixed. Cassian recognized the location instantly. It was the very road where his wife had died, only a short walk from the playground. He had avoided this place for 2 years, but his son had found it, drawn to the ghost of the tragedy that had broken them both. Cassian's breath caught as he rushed forward, fear tearing at his chest. The memory of screeching tires and broken glass echoed in his mind as if it were happening all over again. Serenya kept pace with him, her eyes locked on Alaric with steady determination. When Cassian reached his son, he stopped a few feet away, afraid that rushing him might frighten him into running into the road. Alaric's small frame shook, his face pale, his eyes filled with something Cassian could not bear to see. It was terror mixed with longing. The memory of his mother's last moment burned into his young mind. Cassian spoke softly, pleading with him to step back, to come away, but the boy did not move. He felt the world tilt as his son remained frozen at the edge of danger. Serenya knelt a short distance away, her voice calm and steady, telling Alaric that he was safe, that no one would hurt him, that his father was right there. Cassian could barely breathe, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would break his ribs. Every muscle in his body screamed to grab his son and carry him away, but he knew one wrong move could destroy the fragile progress they had made. And then it happened. In the middle of that unbearable silence, Alaric opened his mouth and screamed. The sound was not a whisper, not a hesitant attempt, but a raw cry that cut through the air like a blade. He cried out for his father, his voice cracking but strong, a sound Cassian had not heard since before the accident. The single word shattered the 2 years of silence and brought Cassian to his knees. He reached out, tears blurring his vision, and pulled his son into his arms. Alaric clung to him, sobbing, his voice trembling but alive. Cassian held him as if he would never let go, his own tears falling freely for the first time in years. Serenia watched, her face soft with relief, her own eyes shining. She had witnessed something extraordinary, the breaking of chains that had bound a child in silence for too long. The moment seemed endless, yet fragile, as if the world had paused to give them space to heal. Cassian whispered words of comfort into his son's hair, telling him that he was safe, that he was loved, that his voice was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Alaric pulled back slightly, his face wet with tears, and whispered again, this time softer, the word father. Cassian's heart broke and healed all at once. He nodded, pressing his forehead to his son's, promising silently that he would never let him feel abandoned again. Serenia stepped closer then, careful not to intrude, and told Alaric how brave he was, how proud she was of him. Alaric looked at her and for the first time managed to whisper another word. Thank you. It was barely audible, but it was there. A gift of trust from a boy who had finally let his voice return. As they walked back to the playground together, Cassian carried his son in his arms. He felt drained, as though he had lived through the accident all over again. Yet there was a strange strength rising in him too. Serenia walked beside him, silent but steady, her presence a calm anchor in the storm. He realized then that he could never repay her for what she had given him. She had guided his son back to his voice, but she had also guided him back to his own humanity. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt hope. Yet beneath that hope lingered fear. He knew the path ahead would not be simple. Healing was never straight, never easy. There would be setbacks and struggles. But there would also be light, and now he believed his son was strong enough to walk toward it. That night Cassian could not sleep. He sat beside Alaric's bed, watching the boy breathe, listening to the soft sound of his murmurs as he dreamed. Each small sound was a miracle. Cassian thought about Serenia, about the way she had knelt calmly on the road, the way her voice had steadied both him and his son. He thought about the walls she kept around herself, the way she avoided his questions, the flicker of sadness in her eyes when she believed no one was looking. He knew there was more to her story than she had shared, and for the first time he wanted to know, not because he was curious but because he cared. He understood that she carried wounds too, perhaps wounds as deep as his own. What he did not know was that her past was bound to collide with his, that the same world of wealth and power he lived in had once destroyed her dreams. For now he only knew that he could not let her slip away. She had given him back his son's voice, and in doing so, she had given him back his life. Months passed after the day Alaric first cried out his father's name on the street where tragedy had once taken his mother. That single moment had broken open years of silence, and it changed everything for Cassian. The boy did not suddenly speak freely, but the walls he had built around himself were no longer impenetrable. He whispered words when he felt safe, short phrases at first, then sentences that stumbled out with hesitation but grew stronger with each passing week. Every sound was a victory, and Cassian savored them with a gratitude he could never describe. The playground became a place of quiet healing. Alaric returned again and again, not because his father pushed him but because he wanted to see Alira. The little girl had become his anchor, the one person who never treated him as broken. With her, he was not a boy defined by silence. He was just a child playing pretend games, laughing, and learning again what it meant to belong. Serenia watched with gentle pride, guiding both children with patience, while Cassian remained close, struggling to balance his instinct for control with the lesson he had been forced to learn, that healing could not be rushed. Cassian grew closer to Serenia during those weeks, though neither of them spoke openly about what was forming between them. He found himself drawn to her honesty, her resilience, and the way she never seemed intimidated by his wealth or his reputation. She treated him not as a billionaire but as a father fighting for his son. That humility unsettled him, yet it grounded him in ways nothing else could. He began to see her not only as the woman who had helped Alaric but as someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. At the same time Serenia battled with her own fears. She felt the pull between them as strongly as he did, but her past still clung to her like a shadow. She remembered the scandal that had destroyed her future, the betrayal that had left her reputation in ruins. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up, and she did not want to risk it by stepping into Cassian's world of scrutiny and power. She convinced herself to keep distance, yet every time she watched Cassian with his son, her heart betrayed her caution. The truth finally began to unravel one afternoon when Cassian arrived at the playground looking unsettled. He told Serenia that one of his oldest business rivals had reappeared, a man named Halden Crown, ruthless and ambitious, who had once tried to undercut him in a major deal. Serenia froze when she heard the name. It was the same man who had orchestrated the scandal that ruined her career years ago, the man who had twisted her work into a lie and left her reputation destroyed. She had fled that world to protect herself and her daughter, never expecting his name to surface again. Now here was Cassian, unknowingly connected to the same man who had stolen her future. She wanted to remain silent, but she could not. When Cassian noticed the change in her expression, he pressed gently, and she confessed everything. She told him about her studies in psychology, her dream of becoming a child therapist, and how Halden Crown had sabotaged her, using his influence to discredit her research and force her out. Her voice shook as she relived the humiliation, but she forced herself to finish. Cassian listened without interruption, his face dark with anger as he realized the depth of the cruelty she had endured. For Cassian, the revelation was more than coincidence. It was proof that their lives had been linked long before they met at the playground. He felt fury at the thought that the same man who had once tried to destroy him had also destroyed Serenia. He vowed silently that Crown would never touch her life again. Yet even as anger burned in him, he felt something deeper. He understood now why Serenia had been so protective of her daughter, why she distrusted wealth and power, why she carried herself with quiet strength. Her survival made him respect her even more. Serenia braced herself for him to pull away, to see her as damaged, but instead he reached for her hand and told her that she had nothing to be ashamed of. He promised her that her past did not define her, and in that moment something in Serenia softened. She saw not the billionaire with empires in his grasp, but the father who had cried on the road when his son found his voice again. Time moved forward and Alaric's progress continued. He still had days when he fell into silence, but the silence was no longer absolute. He spoke more with Alira, slowly with Serenia, and even with his father when he felt safe. The bond between the two families deepened until it felt as though they had always belonged together. The true test came when Alaric's school announced a recital. Each child was to perform in front of parents and classmates. Cassian feared the idea would overwhelm his son, but Alaric surprised him. With Alira by his side, he agreed to participate. On the day of the recital, Cassian sat in the crowded school hall, his hands trembling as he waited. Serenia sat beside him, her presence steadying him, while Alira bounced with excitement. When Alaric stepped onto the stage, Cassian held his breath. The boy looked nervous, his eyes scanning the crowd, but when he saw his father and Serenia smiling up at him, something shifted. He opened his mouth and began to sing with Alira, a simple song about butterflies and sunlight. His voice was fragile at first, but then it grew stronger, filling the room with a sound that Cassian had thought he might never hear again. Tears blurred his vision as he listened, not caring who saw. Serenia wiped her eyes quietly, her daughter beaming on stage, her friend finally free of silence. When the performance ended, the room erupted in applause. Alaric stood tall beside Alira, pride shining in his face, and Cassian felt as though his heart might burst. He turned to Serenia and whispered that he had once believed losing Alaric's voice was the worst fate imaginable. But now he understood that sometimes you had to lose something before you could discover its true value. Serenia looked at him with soft eyes, squeezing his hand gently, and told him that sometimes the hardest wounds carried the seeds of strength. They left the hall together, two families walking side by side, bound by healing, friendship, and something deeper that neither of them denied any longer. Cassian knew that his wealth had never been his true power. His real wealth was his son's laughter, Serenia's trust, and the knowledge that even after unbearable loss, life could still offer second chances. That night Alaric placed a small stone on his nightstand, one he had picked up during a walk with Elira. He told his father quietly that it was his magic stone, the one that reminded him he could always find his voice when he was afraid. Cassian kissed his forehead and felt tears sting his eyes again. He understood that healing was not about miracles or wealth. It was about courage, patience, and the people who believed in you even when you had forgotten how to believe in yourself. As he turned off the light and watched his son drift into sleep,